Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar where we're going to talk about the Indonesian mining market. My name's Claire Chakrabarti, and I'm Manager of International Programs here at Osmine, for those of you who I haven't met before. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're meeting today. For me, here in Brisbane, I acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on the call today. So today's webinar is being delivered by Osmine and Austrade as part of the Accessing New Markets initiative. So many of you will have joined our Indonesian mining market update in June, or perhaps you viewed the recording online. If you haven't, I encourage you to go online after today's webinar, go to the Osmine YouTube website, and you'll see that 2026 Indonesian mining market update. And that session was really about opportunity. What's happening in the Indonesian mining market industry and how the market is changing and where Australian MET's capabilities might fit. And today's webinar is deliberately different because we're moving from what's happening in Indonesia to what does my company need to do about it. By the end of today's session, what we're hoping is that you'll have a really clearer sense of whether Indonesia is a market for your business right now, or whether that you need to do a bit more preparation, or maybe whether it's something you should pause and revisit a little bit later. We're hoping not the latter. So ideally, what we're hoping at the end of today's webinar is that you can take away a really practical 90-day action plan so that you can begin to understand your company's journey in Indonesia. Now, before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. As you will have all heard by the announcement, today's webinar is being recorded. If you don't want your face recorded, then you can turn off your cameras. We do encourage you, though, to leave your cameras on because it is nice to actually see all of your lovely faces when we're talking to you. We will be sharing the recording and the slides with everybody after today's webinar. If during the presentations you have any questions, we have a Q&A open, and I encourage you to put those questions into the Q&A as soon as they pop into your brain. I will say this every time because it happens to me every time I attend a webinar, which is I think of a brilliant question when somebody's talking and then I completely forget it by the time we get to Q&A at the end. So I do encourage you, put those questions into the Q&A. And at the end of today's webinar, we'll be bringing back our panelists, or all of our presenters, sorry, to join a panel discussion where we're going to look at really practical applications of some of the things we talk about today. And if you have your questions in there, I'll be able to use your questions. So please do put as many questions as you can in that chat. So before we start, I just want to have a real quick sense check of where everybody's at. So if you have your phone handy, can you please scan that QR code that's on your screen? If you're on a laptop or you don't have a phone with you, you can go to slido.com and enter the code that's on the screen, so 1711339, and that will take you through to a really, really short questionnaire. I think it's 4 or 5 questions, just for us to get a sense check of where everybody on the call is at within their Indonesia export journey. And it will really help give us some insights that we can use later on in our panel discussion if we know where all the companies on the call are at. Slido is completely anonymous, so there are no right and wrong answers, and I will not know who responds or how you respond, but please, it's really helpful for us to understand who's on the call. So if you could just take a moment to do that. Thank you. So thank you to everybody who has completed the questionnaire already. I can see that there are a number of you are in the midst of already doing it. I am going to move on to the next stage. The questionnaire will remain open, so you can continue answering the questions while I just talk through the agenda for today. I can see that we do have a real mix of people who are just new to entering the market, right the way through to people who are quite experienced and are already exporting. So that's really great to see because that will hopefully lead to a really rich discussion later on at the end of the session. So the agenda for today, we've brought together three really experienced and quite different perspectives on what market readiness is, because market readiness obviously isn't just one question. So we've got Helen from Austrade, who we're going to start with by looking at where Australian METS companies can add value and some of the practical considerations that they need to think about before entering the market and the support pathways available through Austrade. We're then going to be moving on to Martin from Britmondo, who is going to bring in the in-market perspective, what companies need to understand about doing business in Indonesia, relationships, local knowledge, and some of those real practical realities that can affect whether a market approach actually works or not. And then finally, we have Bill Sullivan from Christian Teo and Partners, who'll be looking at the changing Indonesian mining regime and what that evolution, what the evolving regulatory and policy environment means for Australian METS companies. And we're going to bring everybody together then, as I say, at the end for a practical discussion around what this looks like for you as METS companies who are starting out your journeys into this Indonesian market, or some of you who are further along on your journeys as well. So I'm not going to speak too long revisiting the Indonesian mining market because, as I say, hopefully many of you watched the update that we did in June. But just in case anybody did miss our June webinar, I guess I really wanted to emphasize that Indonesia remains a really significant mining market for Australian METS companies. And opportunity alone obviously doesn't necessarily make the market the right for every single company. And this is where today we're going to be exploring those practical questions. So do you have a problem that the Indonesian customer actually needs? Can you demonstrate that your solution is operating in an environment that's relevant to them? And can you support the customers properly once your sale is made? And also, do you have the time and internal capacity to build the relationships that are going to be required in this market? And these are questions that are really sitting behind today's session. Indonesia is an excellent opportunity. Today, we're going to be talking about how you make the decision if that opportunity is right for you. And I will say there, just as a disclaimer, that the information that we are going to be talking about in today's session is purely based on Osmine and the presenter's perspectives. It's not going to be right for every single company, and it certainly doesn't remove your needs as a company to go out and seek independent advice before making any decisions. So moving on to today, so the webinar is a part of a broader Indonesia program. Today's session is all about, as I say, preparation, and the next stage will be connection. So that's for companies who are really interested in going to market in Indonesia. And the next step in that connection journey is Mining Indonesia that's taking place in September. I know many people on the call today will be there. I will be there as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you in person. It's not simply about a trade show. There's going to be lots of opportunities for you to connect with people in market and build that first introductions. And then the value of what you're doing can really become very clear just by being there and being part of the activities. If September is too close for you, there are also some opportunities next year. So we will be hosting our second Indonesia Technology Showcase in March 2027. And this is a webinar activity where we ask Australian METS companies to present their technology to customers within the Indonesian market. So we invite Indonesian miners and Indonesian customers to come and watch these presentations on the webinar, and then they can begin to form those connections. And that one leads into our May 2027 Indonesia mining mission, where Osmane will be leading a delegation out to Indonesia and will be visiting different mining companies and touring the Indonesia market. So today's journey, it really is about being connected and moving forward. So with all of that, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, who is Helen from Austrade. And she's going to provide us with a look at what Australian METS capability can add value and some practical considerations that companies should factor in before entering the market. and the support that Austrade has for you. So I just wanted to check because I can't see her on my screen. Helen, are you on the call? We'll just give her a moment. Okay, so she's in Jakarta meeting room 2. So Renee, if you could just enable them. Excellent. Helen, can you hear us?
It's muted.
It's muted, I think, at the moment. There we go. I think we can hear you now.
You can hear me? Okay. Apologies for the for the technical difficulties. I'll get right underway. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's so good to see so many of you joining. I'm joined in the room here by Austrade's a very good team of business development managers, as well as Seth, Marsha, and Melly. My name's Helen Oh. I'm Trade and Investment Commissioner here in Austrade, Indonesia. My objective today is quite simple. I'd like to provide you with a sense of why Indonesia continues to matter for Australian businesses, highlight the strong Australia-Indonesia partnership that supports business engagement, and explain how Austrade can support you as you begin exploring opportunities in market in Indonesia. Next slide, please. So why Indonesia matters for Australian Mets. I'll keep this section brief because you'll hear practical market perspectives from the speakers that follow. Indonesia is one of Australia's closest neighbours, one of our most important strategic partners, and the largest economy in Southeast Asia in terms of the population size. It continues to grow strongly and remains an increasingly important market for Australian exporters and investors. For Mets companies, Indonesia's mining sector continues to evolve, creating demand for solutions that improve productivity, efficiency, safety, and sustainability. Australian companies have a strong reputation in these areas, and that's one of the reasons why we continue to see interest from Indonesian industry in Australia's capabilities. Next slide, please. So where Australian Mets can add value, the key point here is that Indonesian operators are looking for practical outcomes, whether that's improving productivity, increasing reliability, strengthening safety performance, or supporting sustainability objectives. Australian Mets capabilities are often well aligned with those priorities. What we consistently see is that companies are most successful when they focus on solving a clearly defined business problem for customers here. And that's one of the reasons engaging directly with the market is so important. Next slide, please. So what to factor in before entering Indonesia? Rather than focusing on challenges, I would simply highlight that Indonesia is a market that rewards preparation. Successful companies invest in understanding the market, building relationships, and taking a long-term approach. Relationships and local knowledge matter, and this is the case in a lot of other markets, but more important in Indonesia. The good news is that businesses do not need to navigate that journey alone, and that's where Austrade can support. Next slide, please. Australia-Indonesia collaboration. I'd like to place a strong emphasis on this section because it helps to frame Indonesia as more than just a commercial opportunity market. Indonesia is a priority partner for Australia with a strong bilateral foundation that gives our companies greater confidence as they consider entering the market. One of Australia's advantages in Indonesia is that businesses are entering this market where there's already a strong foundation between our two countries at political level, at industry level, and also at people-to-people level as well. Australia and Indonesia have a long history of economic partnership, and that relationship continues to deepen. And today, Indonesia is Australia's 9th largest two-way trading partner, with bilateral trade worth more than $35 billion in financial year of 24-25. Australia is also a significant supplier of minerals and energy that supports Indonesia's economic growth and industrial development. Importantly for businesses, there is also a strong institutional framework that underpins commercial engagement. That includes trade agreements, IHEPA, which is often the most relevant agreement for Australian METS companies and provides important market access and investment benefits. It's worth noting that under IHEPA, two-way trade and investment between Indonesia and Australia doubled over 5 years. ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement and Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, also support broader regional trade and investment engagements. Beyond these trade agreements, we're also seeing growing collaboration across a number of areas that are highly relevant to the resources sector. And these include Climate, Renewable Energy and Infrastructure Partnership, we call it Kinetic for short, which was launched yesterday. This supports climate, renewable energy and infrastructure collaboration between our two governments. Catalyst and Prospera, which are also Australian development funding, these support commercial infrastructure and policy cooperation between our two governments as well. For METS businesses, these initiatives are important because they demonstrate the depth of Australia-Indonesia engagements and create additional pathways for collaboration. And this is where Austrade can really support you. Through our trade services, we help Australian businesses translate those opportunities into practical commercial outcomes. Our support generally falls into 3 categories. Advice, which is helping you to understand export readiness, market conditions, and market entry considerations. We also provide connections. We facilitate introductions and business matching support and access to relevant market stakeholders when you come in to visit Indonesia. And we also provide practical support. We help companies navigate practical market entry and regulatory issues as they arise. We also encourage businesses to make use of Austrade's Go Global Toolkit, which is an online self-directed resource which provides practical guidance on export readiness, market prioritization, regulatory landscape, and also building an export strategy. The key message I'd leave with you is that Austrade's role is not just to help you understand the opportunity in Indonesia, we're also here to help you take the next step and make the right connections and navigate the market as you plan to develop. Next slide, please. Through our regional and market-focused initiatives, events and activities, we provide opportunities to engage through business missions, events and programs, activation programs. And for today's audience, Mining Indonesia, as Claire mentioned before, is the most immediate and relevant touch point. It provides an opportunity to better understand customer needs in Indonesia, have in-person meetings with potential partners, and gain first-hand exposure to market, which is ever so important in this geopolitical environment. It's also part of a broader pipeline of Austrade-led resources and energy activities across Southeast Asia region. And I'd encourage anyone interested to have a conversation with our team after today's session. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide I have. I'll leave you with 3 simple messages. Firstly, Indonesia remains a significant long-term opportunity market for Australian METS companies. Second, the Australia-Indonesia relationship provides a strong platform for business engagement and collaboration. And lastly, engage early in partnership with Ausmine and Austrade. Whether you're just starting to assess the market opportunities or looking to strengthen an existing presence, we are here to help with advice, connections, and practical support. So thank you very much. My team and I look forward to continuing to engage with you and support you, and looking forward to seeing you in Indonesia very soon. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that great introduction to the market. And it was really great to hear about all the opportunities and ways that Austrade are able to support the Australian METS companies in market. And obviously, we've talked about those amazing opportunities in the last webinar. So knowing that there's some practical support there to really help is very important. So now we're going to move on to our next presentation from Martin, and we're going to build on that, looking at what the practical reality of operating and building in relationships in Indonesia looks like. So I'd like to welcome Martin from Britmundo, who has worked really extensively in Indonesia and brings a real practical understanding of this business environment and the way relationships work in market. So I'd like to hand over to you, Martin, and then if you can begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. If I could have the first slide.
Yeah.
Let's hope I can see it this time. Turn you to Claire's screen. Speaker, gallery, sort by gallery, release video, full screen. No. I still can't see the actual presentation come up.
Hi, Martin.
Right.
If you just go up the top, and you should have two tabs. So there'll be webinar and then Claire's screen.
Yep, got it.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Right, this is actually a bit of a continuation of what happened in June. And I'm going to run through this because we've got to start with what happened there. The focus back there, next slide, please. Right, to talk about the size of the Indonesian market to the Australian market, this little map here shows you where the mining concessions are in red, where the plantations are in yellow, and where the forests are in some oil and gas areas. So you can see the vast areas of mining concessions that have been awarded in Indonesia, and put that in perspective from west to east. Indonesia is further across than continental United States. So that'll give you a feeling for how big the place is. And it's still a very dynamic market, but there has been some substantial changes to the way the government thinks about this. And we've got to look at that. Next slide, please. So what's changed between 2025 and 2026? I've got to be a little bit careful here, because following me is a guy who's a real expert in this particular field. And so what I say might be corrected by Bill. But the Indonesian government has really moved to ensure that the value add is front and center. The nickel stuff went crazy in 2025 and led to a collapse of the nickel price globally. Indonesia is still has the largest reserves of nickel in the world, and I think it's still the largest producer of nickel. And they dished out concessions for nickel mining like they were giving approvals for corner stores. And it was pretty crazy. So there were far too many of them, and the government has understood that and has slowed that development dramatically. But yeah, to connect back to the real focus, they're really looking at value added. And there's a bit of a backstory to this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So previously, Indonesia was a place where you went mining. Now they want to do the processing, they want to do the manufacturing, and they want value chain. Now, the backstory I was going to mention was the fact that Indonesia needs somewhere between 6 and 7% growth just to provide the jobs for the new people coming into the market. Now, that's a huge number. Most Western economies would celebrate for years on 6 to 7% growth. For the first 6 months this year, I think the Indonesian economy grew by 5.45%, and that really didn't quite hit the mark. It's got close, but they still need substantial growth just to sort out the new people coming into the marketplace. And sadly, the informal sector, the sector which the government doesn't really capture completely, is still a dominant part of the employment market. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to look at the sort of tools that might help you come to Indonesia, the first thing we want to look at is, the information that you can gather. And there are some pretty decent tools available to you from engaging in finding out what's going on. I'd recommend the Australian Indonesian Business Council, Carden, which is the local Chamber of Commerce. The World Bank have some fantastic data, but probably most important is Austrade. They've got years and years of experience here. The Australian Embassy in Jakarta, I think, is the largest Australian embassy in the world. And they really can give you a lot of assistance. Then when we look at key business advisors, obviously we've got Bill's outfit, which is Christian Teo and Partners. I think they're related to Harwood, if I'm correct in that, Bill. Was it? Yeah, Stevenson Harwood. There are a great number of legal advisors. There's a great number of tax advisors. All the big guys are in Indonesia. And then there's numerous engineering consultancies. Some of them will be very internationally orientated and some not. So you've got to decide on who you choose. From an engineering perspective, most of the large engineering companies are here. I've found, I'm a civil structural engineer by training, but I've found that the Indonesian engineering groups that really understand what they're looking at tend to be quite conservative. And the converse is also true. The guys who don't know what they're doing are not conservative at all. So you've got to be a bit careful about who you use in this market. Market intel resources. There are a number of clubs and organisations. The Jakarta Mining Club, spelt with a D. EMD, the Indonesian Miner, is a really good organisation. And they can put on some really good networking events that will help you enormously. There are also Osman Cham, PwC, active in the mining space, and once again, the Australian government. And I think Helen mentioned before the Catalyst program and Kinetic, which are things that you really should investigate because you never know. They could actually have a small amount of money they help you with. A bunch of publications available out there. PwC do an annual one. There's also Petromindo and the Asian Miner. Now, one of the things that I thought worth mentioning was some of the challenges. I'm sure that when you're discussing strategically whether or not you come to Indonesia, looking at things you can control and can't control. Indonesia suffers from a few earthquakes and it's a very large country, so natural disasters do happen. There's some ethnic and religious tensions, but they're not so virulent at the moment. Radical Islam will always be mentioned, but again, I think that's pretty well controlled and well thought of. And then there's macroeconomic events which will affect Indonesia, will affect us all. But Indonesia has a pretty big internal engine. So in the years that I've been here, the macro events haven't always hurt too much, with the exception of 98, which got pretty crazy. That's known as Chrismal here. Now, challenges you can control. There's corruption, there's site unrest. Site unrest is a really interesting thing. Most of the mine closures that I've been involved in have been because the local community got upset about something. So managing those local communities is incredibly important. IP issues, payment risk will always be an issue. Infrastructure can be poor in some remote locations, so the logistics become a challenge. As interesting sidebar, the Indonesian economy spends 24% of its GDP on logistics. That's connecting, there's 1,000 inhabited islands of the 13,500 islands that there are in Indonesia, and they all have to be connected. Good governance is something you can deal with. Complex bureaucracy, we have in abundance, and just something to be aware of. Manpower rules, something you want to understand and not fall afoul of. Next slide, please. Right. If you do want to come to Indonesia and get involved here, often Australian companies will turn up to sell a technology. And you'll often be dealing with businessmen who aren't necessarily miners. They won't necessarily be technocrats that will understand exactly what you're selling. So my recommendation to you would be to sell solutions to pain, to sell solutions that take problems away rather than selling the technology. You want to better reduce downtime, you want to better reduce energy consumption, improve efficiency, improve uptime, that sort of carry on. So look carefully at the message that you're giving and think about that, delivering that to a layperson. I've been in many, many presentations where a guy who's an expert on ore recovery will sit there and tell everybody exactly what's going on from his very technical perspective, and that might not be the best approach. Next slide, please. What does it take to be successful in this wonderful country that I'm a guest in? A regular presence, a little bit of local language. Now, in saying that, there's no requirement that you become fluent in Bahasa Indonesia. You'll be dealing with Indonesian executives who will speak 2 or 3 or maybe even more languages. Their language abilities far exceed the average Australian. So, but to have a few basic phrases, greetings, thank yous, etc., is useful because it shows that you've actually tried. And to be successful, you've got to build trust and you've got to build relationships with the right senior people. And in saying that, relationship building is absolutely vital. And the number of times I've been in development meetings where the people I'm taking come out and say, we nailed that one, we've got this job. That doesn't happen. It takes real time. So you've got to be prepared for a bit of a long play. And the Indonesian side of the equation will often say, are these guys going to be here in 5 years' time? And what's their after sales going to be like? And are they going to help train our people, etc., etc.? So be prepared for those sort of long plays because the market really does look well at local partnerships, in-country support, a long-term commitment, and Indonesian staff. Next slide, please. So, how to win part 1? Have a local presence. Even a small representative office doesn't have to have an Australian sitting in the desk, but having an in-country office and having someone who can get out there and beat your drum for you is very useful. So try and build that into your business plan. And in choosing your partner and or your staff, it is the most important decision you will make if you decide to come to Indonesia. So choose carefully and use the networks and just really thoroughly vet what you're doing. I've come across and worked for a number of companies that have made some very bad decisions about partners, and it can make it very difficult to succeed in this country. So don't just go for the politically connected guy. look at who can really be part of your business in the long term. Next slide, please. Part 2 of how to win in Indonesia is, again, the message that you're delivering. You'll be dealing with business people. So look at your rates of return. Many Indonesian businessmen that I've dealt with in the past, if they can't get their money back in 3 years, they're not going to do it. That seems to be a sort of a special number for them. So have a look at what sort of value you can bring to the table to help these guys with their bottom line. And remember, you've got to be flexible, because Indonesia, the pathway to nirvana will not be straight. There'll be lots of twists and turns in it. And, as I said before, invest in your after-sales support. Next slide, please. Right. Some of these do's and don'ts are a bit trivial and some of them are not. But I won't go through the whole list, but have a look down that list. I mean, business cards, probably a thing in the past in Australia, but still important here. When you're in a meeting and you remember you're dealing with a guy for who English is a second or third language. So if you don't understand exactly what he's saying, make sure you clarify and re-clarify so you get the message in the end. It's much better than actually going away with the wrong message. You've got to be a little bit careful about how you respect the environments, dress conservatively, etc., etc. One of the very, very important don'ts in the marketplace: never lose your temper. If you lose your temper in any way, you've lost the room. You've lost whoever you're talking to. It's something that you might not see it immediately, but it'll become evident in time. So be really, really careful about how you treat your staff and how you treat your colleagues there. They don't forgive easily if you get that part of it wrong. And there's a few down there that are sort of trivial, but again, it's all part of getting the message right. Next slide, please. Some emerging sectors to look at. Obviously, copper is still a big thing because the EV exercise is very important. And I was sitting with a mining lead only a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, in 10 years' time, our entire mining operation will be electric. That's his thinking. And he said, so we need 40 megawatts to make that happen. So he's going to go out and find a way of self-generating 40 extra megawatts on top of the PLN supply he already has. So that'll give you a feeling for what the copper market might be like and the energy market. Bauxite and alumina is the new glamour girl in the marketplace. And there's a huge amount of bauxite in West Kalimantan and some in Sumatra as well. So that's going to be developed. I think the Indonesian government are already being very careful about what they're going to let happen there, because they do not want a repeat of the nickel debacle with too many concessions being offered and too much of a rat race to get at it. Tin, they've been big in tin for a long, long while. Obviously, the rare earths is coming, and coal will still be a place where there's going to be coal's going to be an important part of the marketplace for a while yet. And Indonesia has significant reserves of coking coal. And when I talk to clients about coal generally, thermal coal and coking coal are, to me, different beasts. And we'll need coking coal for a long time yet. Thermal coal, yeah, not so keen on it, but it's part and parcel of the marketplace. So we've got to understand what it is. Next slide, please. Right. The risks that are worthwhile understanding, some of these I've covered already, but the regulatory environment can be a bit volatile. And Bill, who's far more expert than I am at this particular side of it, will be telling you a bit about this. Payment risk. So make sure that when you set yourself up, you're doing so with a lot of care and attention to how you get paid and when you get paid. You don't want your customer owning you. There's growing pressure on local content, but that's something that can be understood and dealt with early on in projects. Obviously, we talked about the infrastructure constraints very briefly, and there are some things you'll have to do here because it's just a bit difficult to get to some of these remote locations. You will always have a little bit of ESG regulation, reputational risk in this marketplace. So that's something that especially the bigger guys have got to be really, really aware of. And cultural misalignment is really part of that stuff I spoke about before, where you've just got to understand that you are in a different culture. These people do, my Indonesian friends will react to things in a different sort of way. So you've got to be really, really careful about how you judge that and how you understand that. Next slide, please. Gaps in the market. I think Indonesia still presents an enormous amount of opportunity. They really do want to expand. They are looking at rapid growth, and they want, especially on the processing side. So if your company has skills on the processing side, you need to start looking pretty fast because there's lots of opportunity there. Specialist technical capability. And Australians have excelled in this area over the years. So there's a lot to be done. And Australian METS companies remain very respected in this particular arena. Next slide, please. One of the things we do need to understand is the influence that the Chinese have had on the Indonesian market. They're here in force. They're not universally loved, but they've brought a lot of money to the marketplace, and they've now got their foot on a huge amount of material. They control 70-80% of the nickel processing, a lot of the smelting. They do a lot of turnkey stuff where they just deliver the whole deal. Finance, the building of it, the running of it, the design, and they've deployed billions of dollars in doing so. So be aware of that. And that really is a segue into the next slide, which if we could have that. Don't go chasing the price because it's unlikely that you're ever going to beat out a really competitive Chinese bid. You want to look at reliability, the ESG components, the life cycle costs in particular, and after sales service. You want to look at how you can deliver a better product, not just quickly, not just cheapest, and not just the lowest capex. So, OPEX, that's a good thing. I was I've done a lot of work in the EV arena and in the renewable energy arena. And one of my customers, they've got a big pile of Chinese batteries, which no longer function. And they're 5 years old, and that isn't good enough. So those sort of stories are not uncommon. But so be aware of that, and be aware that you're going to be up against some Chinese companies that will be offering all sorts of amazing stuff for not very much money. Next slide, please. So to start wrapping up this brief presentation, Indonesia is still a big market, but it's more sophisticated than it was. It's more strategic, and they're very, very downstream focused. So to win here, you've got to get local, build some trust. It'll take a bit of time, and look at how you can demonstrate your long-term commitment. And you won't be the cheapest. You'll never be the cheapest. It's unlikely that that'll be the case. But you want to have the best long-term outlook. You want to be the most reliable and the most practical. And you'll have a decent chance of succeeding here. And there are some Australian companies that have done extremely well by delivering a top-end product for the right sort of money. Next slide, please. Okay, so the final word before I get on to a goofy photograph, animation of myself. Indonesia is no longer just an exporting minerals place. They're building these massive industrial parks, and they're building industrial ecosystems with very big processing facilities inside of them. So to get into it, you've got to get into that end of the equation, and there's a pretty decent future in that. So if you want to know anything about what I've said today, especially with regard to who you could and should talk to, and obviously if I'm going to recommend a legal advisor, it's going to be Christian Tiro and Partners. But yeah, there's a lot of guys out there. There's all the big tax guys are here, good engineering companies, including Britt Minder. So there's plenty to be had, and if you want some advice, don't hesitate to give me a bell. And last slide, if you would. There are my contact details, and that's a terrible representation of myself done by some goofy machine somewhere. So apologies for that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was a really informative presentation. And I think everything you've described there is absolutely incredibly important for the companies who are starting out to kind of understand the market and know where they can start. So it's really great. And I do encourage you to get in contact with Martin if you are joining the market, as well as the Austrade team. And obviously Osmine, he's somebody in market with a lot of knowledge. Now, we were supposed to be moving next onto a presentation by a Mets company who are working in market. Unfortunately, today seems to be the day for technical issues, and our presenter wasn't able to join us. But before the call, I did have a very quick conversation with him, and he actually said something which I thought really led off Bill's slides, which was his one piece of advice he wanted to share with everybody on the call today. Was around when you're having a conversation in market, make sure that conversation really matters. And he said the biggest mistake that he made, and he said it's probably the mistake that many people make when they're in market, is the fact that when they're talking to different people, they don't tailor what they're saying to meet the person that they're meeting. So, for example, the person who's running an operation or an engineer, they're going to be looking for very different things, and they're going to be asking really different questions. So, for example, if the person that you meet, you go to Mining Indonesia and you meet someone in the operations team, they're going to be really interested in, will this make my operations safer? Is it going to make it more reliable? Or will it help me be more productive? The technical person, if you're speaking to a technical person, they're not going to care about that. They're going to want to know if your solution actually works. Whether it's going to be easy to integrate into what they already have and where it might have worked before. Then, of course, if you meet a procurement person, they're not interested in the technical stuff. They are interested in the bottom line. What's the total cost, delivery, what warranty you're offering, and what local support are you going to have? And then senior management are looking on return on investment, whether or not there's a risk reduction or any strategic value. And a local partner wants to understand whether there is a genuine role for them, whether you can support them to represent your solution properly. Because if they're representing many solutions, they want to make sure that the people they partner with are not going to let them down, because that obviously reflects badly on them as well. So the lesson that I really wanted to share with you today, and what I got from the conversation, was it doesn't matter and it doesn't change what your product does. It's about making it of value to the person in front of you. So, for example, if you take a moment and you think about your own businesses, if you were going to Mining Indonesia, think about why would a company care about the problem that you have, and what problem are you solving for that person in front of you? And depending what their background is, you're going to lead with something a little bit different, because each of these people need to hear something different, especially if you want to get to that second conversation, which is where obviously we all want to end up. So I did just think that was a really important piece of learning that I wanted to share with you. I do apologize for my quickly thrown together AI slide. Unfortunately, it only came out that he couldn't attend about 15 minutes before, but I really hope that was important. And when I share around the slides, he's also said I can share around his details. So if anyone wants to reach out to Reza, you can do so, and he will be able to have a conversation with anybody, and he's happy to talk through their journey to market and how they operate in Indonesia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our next speaker now. So as we've already heard from Martin, Bill is very well known in the Indonesian market. He's from Christian Teo and Partners, and he's kindly joined us today to help unpack some of the significant changes that are occurring at the moment in the Indonesian mining regime. And he's going to go beyond just looking at those individual regulations to thinking about what changes those actually being driven by these changes. So thank you, Bill. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Let's move to the next slide, if we can. And then go to the next slide, Claire. And I think we can go to the next slide. So you shouldn't be off-put. This is not going to be a conversation about laws and regulations. I just want to make sure that you all understand what the big trends are in terms of the regulation of the Indonesian mining industry, because those trends are critical to the success or otherwise of your business in Indonesia. The last 18 months, the last 2 years, since the commencement of the presidency of Prabowo Subianto has been quite extraordinary. It's seen numerous legal, regulatory, and policy changes that materially impact the Indonesian mining industry. Perhaps more importantly, it's seen very significant moves to impose greater control on and enforce stricter regulatory compliance by mining companies. This has lots of implications for you Mets guys. You also need, though, to understand the bigger picture here. The Indonesian government at the moment is operating under very significant pressure from oil price shocks and other fiscal problems. So I'm going to explain to you how this is impacting Indonesia and indirectly how it's going to impact you guys. In addition, Indonesia is struggling with a very difficult trade relationship with the US. It's been obliged to sign what is called the Agreement on Reciprocal Trade with the US, and that has very important implications for Australian investors and Mets companies. And if we've got time, we'll talk about that. Next slide, Claire, please. Perhaps the most important thing I can share with you is why have we seen all these significant regulatory and control developments in 2025 and 2026. They're directly attributable to two things. First, something called Golden Indonesia 2045, which is the president's transformative vision for Indonesia. And second, they're being driven by increasing government fiscal and trade pressure, which I previously alluded to. Now, you need to understand very carefully that this is a challenging mining industry regime, and accordingly, it represents new challenges and, frankly, new risks for Australian investors and Mets companies, but at the same time, it creates new opportunities for Australian investors and Mets companies in Indonesia. And you need to be smart enough to manage those challenges and identify those opportunities. Next slide, please, Claire. So the takeaway that I would like you to leave with is that Australian investors and Mets companies can still do very well in Indonesia, and they can manage the new challenges and take advantage of the new opportunities by first understanding, not from a legal perspective, but from a broader perspective, the details of the recent developments, perhaps even more importantly, why these recent developments have occurred and what the implications of these recent developments are for their existing and proposed investment and business models. And once you've developed that understanding, you can then rethink your proposed investment structure and investment model for Indonesia to take account of those changing risks and opportunities. And this is really the message I want to share with you. Next slide. You cannot be successful in the Indonesian mining industry today unless you understand the president's vision for Indonesia. He calls it Golden Indonesia 2045. And it is all set out in extraordinary detail in the president's book, Strategic Transformation, The Move to Golden Indonesia 2045. This book is available in an English translation. And even if you don't particularly like reading, every one of you should read this if you're serious about coming to Indonesia, because it's a real eye-opener. Next slide. The basic idea behind Golden Indonesia 2045 is that Indonesia and Indonesians have been shortchanged in their development, and they have not achieved the level of economic well-being and advancement that they're entitled to. Accordingly, the president's vision is that by 2045, the centenary of Indonesia's independence, Indonesia will be a first world economy with a level of GDP, a level of per capita individual income equivalent to that which prevails in first world economies. At the same time, he wants better healthcare, nutrition, education, a cleaner environment, supposedly less corruption as well. These are big ideas, and you need to understand how you fit in those ideas. The next slide. It's important you understand that Golden Indonesia 2045 is frankly a very nationalistic, populist, and parochial vision. It involves a significant emphasis on social engineering, wealth redistribution, and realizing Indonesia's rightful place in the world, whatever that may be. And people have very different views about it. You also need to understand very clearly that the government's perceived importance of progressing the realization of Golden Indonesia 2045 is only going to increase in the next 3 years in the run-up to the next presidential election in 2029. Because I can assure every one of you that the president is going to run again in 2029, and his election campaign is going to be based on what I did in achieving Golden Indonesia 2045. Okay, you also need to be very mindful of how the president proposes to go about Golden Indonesia 2045. He says that he's going to achieve it by bringing about accelerated GDP growth of a minimum of 8% per annum for at least 10 consecutive years. And at the same time, he's clearly intending to use Danantara, Indonesia's newly established sovereign wealth fund, which we're going to talk more about, and each of you need to know about, to implement his policies and otherwise facilitate the realization of Golden Indonesia 2045. Go on, next slide, please, Claire. No, back. Oh, yeah, that slide is fine. That slide is fine. 8% GDP growth per annum for 10 years? Really? Is that achievable? That's a huge ask, ladies and gentlemen, given that for the last 15, 20 years, Indonesia's GDP growth per annum has never really got beyond 5 to 6%, and on occasion has fallen significantly below 5%. So how are we going to get from there to 8%? A big question, which is very relevant to you all. Next slide. Just before we do that, you need to understand that if Indonesia only continues to grow at its current GDP level of about 5.4%, it won't be until 2060 or beyond that Indonesia actually achieves first world economic status. So there's a lot riding on Golden Indonesia 2045. Next slide, please. Now, here's where you guys come in. Here's where the mining industry comes in. The mining industry is absolutely central to the realization of Golden Indonesia 2045. The president refers to Indonesia's abundant mineral resources, particularly its metal minerals and coal, as being what he likes to call indicators of Indonesia's advanced potential capital, and as providing the foundation of a progressive Indonesia. Next slide, please, Claire. As Martin alluded to, downstreaming, local value-added activity is a key policy of the Prabowo government, and it has an incredibly important link to Golden Indonesia 2045, because the president sees local value-added downstreaming activity, particularly in the mining space, as being the main source or driver of 8% annual GDP growth, and is ensuring the realization of at least the economic and financial well-being aspects of Golden Indonesia 2045. So this is why the mining sector is front and center of the government's attention at this time. Next slide. According to the president, Indonesia's natural resources, including its metal minerals and coal, need to be much more effectively developed, controlled, notice that word very carefully, please, and managed in order to achieve Golden Indonesia 2045. And the president is quite explicit in his book in saying that Golden Indonesia 2045 will not become a reality unless there are fundamental changes made as to how Indonesia's natural resources are controlled, developed, and managed. Perhaps you can now start to get a sense of why we're moving into a new era of greater government control for the Indonesian mining industry. And you need to be very mindful of this as potential entrants. Next slide. The 2025-2026 major regulatory and control developments that I referred to at the very beginning are part of this process of changing how Indonesia's natural resources are controlled, developed, and managed. And they're very consistent with the president's strategy for making Golden Indonesia 2045 a reality. They really are tangible evidence of policy implementation and follow-through. I'm always amazed, ladies and gentlemen, when people say, I didn't realize he was going to do this. How could he be serious about doing this? The president told us all what he was going to do back in 2023 in his book. And blow me down, he's now following through and delivering, rightly or wrongly, on what he said he was going to do in his book. Next slide. somewhat worryingly, is that the government's mindset is that economic democracy has no place in the management of Indonesia's natural resources. And even more concerning, the proper role of mining companies and the mining industry is to facilitate implementation of government policy, including the realization of Golden Indonesia 2045. And perhaps most importantly, the financial interests of mining companies must be subordinated to the national interest as determined by the government. These are very challenging concepts, ladies and gentlemen, which you should all be thinking very carefully about as you approach the idea of entering the Indonesian market. This is a very different government mindset to what we've seen in the past. Next slide, please, Claire. In addition to the control aspects, you need to understand that the government is also requiring a much higher financial contribution from the mining industry now and expected in the future compared to what it was in the past. And this is primarily being driven by the hugely populist social welfare type programs that the provincial government has announced. There is an extraordinarily expensive free nutritional lunch program for children that will cost supposedly 335 trillion rupiah in 5 years. This is an extraordinary number, ladies and gentlemen. It's almost hard to get your head around how big a number that is. At the same time, the president has announced a free health check program, a renovation of schools program, a high quality hospital program, an integrated flagship schooling program, and a food estate program. These are extraordinarily expensive social welfare programs. Depends on what your view of the world is. They may be a good thing or they may be a bad thing, but inescapably, they're going to cost a fortune to implement. And the president has you guys, the mining industry, firmly in his sights as the people who are going to make a greater financial contribution to funding these programs. Think carefully about that, please. Next slide, please. You also need to understand how subject to and sensitive to is the Indonesian economy when it comes to oil prices. Indonesia is a net importer of oil. In addition, Indonesia offers hugely generous subsidies for electricity and gasoline, petrol. Okay, this is a huge burden on the Indonesian budget, but it is so ingrained in the expectations of the Indonesian people that it is impossible politically for any government to now remove those subsidies. To put this in context, the Indonesian budget for 2026-2027 assumes an oil price of $70 a ton, $70 a barrel. Today, the oil price is $94 a barrel. And within a few weeks, it's been $120 a barrel. That bodes very badly for fiscal stability in Indonesia. Accordingly, the likelihood that the government will continue to expect an even higher financial contribution from the mining industry if oil prices continue to go up is almost inevitable. Next slide, please. Again, just very briefly, so you understand how significant subsidies are in Indonesia. Subsidies have gone from 106 trillion in 2020 to 210 trillion rupiah in 2026, almost a doubling in 5 years. And the subsidies are now the most significant expenditure item in the government's budget. I hope you can see very clearly how exposed Indonesia is to energy price shocks and why this might be a big issue for everyone in the mining industry. Next slide, Claire. Okay. You need to understand. I think we might have missed the slide, Claire. I think we need to go back. Right. No, right. Okay. There definitely are, despite all these concerning things, new opportunities emerging. First, there is opportunity to work with Danantara, Indonesia's new sovereign wealth fund, which is driving many of the government's policies and is an increasingly important player in the mining industry, in the downstream processing and refining industry, indeed in the implementation of all government policies. And Danantara is a surprisingly professional organization. It's recruited excellent people from different private sector organizations, and people are generally positively and pleasantly surprised by working with Danantara. At the same time, you need to think about partnering with different people to the parties that you might traditionally think about in entering a new industry. One of the changes that has occurred in Indonesia in terms of social engineering is the government favoring the grant of mining concessions not to private sector companies anymore, but rather to state-owned enterprises, to regional government-owned enterprises, to cooperatives, to small and medium-sized enterprises, and quite extraordinarily, to religious organizations. Religious organizations might be a step too far for all of you in terms of potential partners, but state-owned enterprises, regional government-owned enterprises in particular, could be a good opportunity because these are the people who are going to have mining concessions going forward, okay? You also need to understand that these newly emerging players in the Indonesian mining industry, although they're favored by the government in terms of obtaining mining concessions, they face very serious capital constraints. In most instances, they lack mining experience and they have very inadequate technical expertise. There is an opportunity for METS companies to work with these newly privileged mine concession owners and help them and provide them with the capital, the experience, and the technical expertise that they so demonstrably lack. Next slide, please, Claire. You also need to understand that most of the easy geological deposits in Indonesia have already been worked out, okay? Increasingly, the opportunities for mining companies are in particularly remote and difficult areas, underground mining rather than open pit mining in areas lacking all supporting infrastructure. This offers really good opportunities for Australian METS companies that have real cutting-edge technology and world-class products and equipment to manage some of these issues. So that, again, is an opportunity. Now, I also want to briefly mention IHEP, which both Claire and Helen from Austrade mentioned. As you will be aware or should be aware, IHEP is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Australia and Indonesia. It contains many things. It's a hugely long document, but perhaps of increasing relevance to everyone is it includes what is called a most favored nation clause. What's a most favored nation clause? A most favored nation clause is a clause that says if Indonesia gives any investment benefits to investors from any other country, it must give those very same investment benefits to Australian investors. This is hugely significant, ladies and gentlemen, particularly in light of the agreement on reciprocal trade, which Indonesia has so recently signed with the US and gives US investors some extraordinary benefits and special treatment and exempts US investors from numerous regulatory obligations in Indonesia. The Australian government has done a wonderful thing negotiating the inclusion of a most favoured nation clause in IACEPA, because it means that each of you can put up your hands and say, me too. Thank you very much. You've given these benefits to American investors. You have to give it to me as well. This is something to watch because it could really be transformative in making Indonesia and the Indonesian mining industry an increasingly attractive place for Australian investors. Next slide, please, Claire. Okay, all right, so let me wrap up here. It's the president's determination to achieve gold in Indonesia 2045 that largely explains what is happening in terms of changes to Indonesia's mining regime or environment. You've got to expect that as GDP growth continues to fall far short of 8% and the government's fiscal demands increase, the pressure on mining companies and indirectly on metals companies to make an even greater financial contribution will only grow. Accordingly, you should expect and anticipate that 2026 to 2029 will see a continuation of legal policy and regulatory developments unfavorable to mining companies, okay? You also need to understand that Australian investors and Australian metals companies are not the real focus of the government's compliance, control, and fiscal initiatives. These initiatives are focused very much really on domestic mining companies. But you need to be careful to make sure that you don't become potential collateral damage. Okay? Next slide, Claire. So I would say to you that Australian investors and metals companies can still do well in the Indonesian mining industry by understanding the evolving legal policy and regulatory environment, identifying how the associated opportunities and challenges have changed, be open to working with Danantara and other newly favoured categories of mining participants, realize there's opportunity here to leverage the capital constraints, limited mining expertise, and the lack of technical expertise of these newly favoured mining concession holders. And finally, be open to and ready to take advantage of the agreement on reciprocal trade and that's indirectly made available to you by IACEPA and the promise of most favoured nation status. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was a really thorough understanding of the market, and it was really great to hear your perspectives on the changes and gold in Indonesia moving to 2045 and what that might mean for Australian metals companies. So I can see we've already got lots of questions flowing in. So I am going to move straight into the next part, which is the questions, if that's okay. So unfortunately, Helen has had to leave, but we still have Martin and Bill here. So if anyone does have any extra questions, please put them into the chat that you can see there in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to answer those now. So one of the first questions that actually came in, I think it's probably for you, Martin, which is that lots of people talk about the importance of building relationships. But what does that look like in reality? Do you have any tips or ideas on how you can do that as a foreigner coming into the Indonesian market?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's some things that I included in my presentation, which are sort of, some of them are trivial, but some of them matter. But I think fundamentally, and this is a continuous message through all four presentations, firstly, get your message right. Understand who you're talking to and how you're going to sell your product, whatever it is. Then in Indonesia, you've got to get face to face. Now, I would strongly recommend leveraging Austrade to help you do that. They can open more doors than probably any other organisation you'll come across in Indonesia related to Australia. So use Austrade, crack those doors open, and then pitch your product. What happens after that will depend upon the quality of the product and how well you pitch it. But as I said, get your message right first and go and speak to the right people. Interestingly enough, it relates to some extent. I was at the Indonesian miner trade show. Well, it's not a trade show, it's a conference a few months ago. A couple of our speakers stood up there in front of 600 or 700 people and got deeply technical about their product. And 90% of the room was snoring by the end of it because they didn't understand. These guys were very, very good at what they were presenting, and there was only a handful of people in the room who had any idea what they were talking about. So that's that whole get your message right. Understand, and Raza said the same thing, yeah? Understand who you're talking to and make sure that the message is appropriate to them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. I think we've all been there where we've done a presentation and we realized we've over-egged that and we've gone too deep with our science knowledge or our technology knowledge, and we just haven't met where the audience is at. So knowing who your audience are and what they're looking for is incredibly important. Bill, do you have any advice for any of the companies on the call, how they could begin to form those connections?
I think the most important thing, Claire, is the point I made several times, and that is to be open to the new players in the Indonesian mining industry. The Indonesian mining industry is not like any other mining industry you'll have encountered anywhere else. And accordingly, the people who can be potential sources of business for you are very different from other countries, certainly very different from Australia. The increasing involvement of the state in the Indonesian mining industry means unquestionably that you should be looking very closely at working with state-favoured parties, in particular state-owned enterprises, because for better or for worse, they are the future of the Indonesian mining industry as the government sees it.
No, that's really important. And I guess leading in from that as well, there's another question we have in the chat here. So obviously with other markets, where we've seen the greater government control, it doesn't actually necessarily mean more opportunities. It often maybe needs less opportunities for Australian METS companies, especially those that have quite sophisticated technology. Because obviously where you get people perhaps who are less technical in positions of purchasing, you're more likely to have a focus on low cost above those technical purchasing things. So what do you think, what's your view on how these changes might impact Australian METS companies' engagement with customers?
For me, Claire, is that question?
Yes, that's, yeah.
Well, as I said before, I think it creates new opportunities. Successful Australian METS companies will be the ones that realise, hey, these people who now are favoured with mining concessions, they know much less about how to run a successful mining operation than did the previously savvy private sector parties who dominated the Indonesian mining industry. And accordingly, their need for the type of expertise that Australian METS companies can provide is much greater than it was in the case of the previous players. And accordingly, successful Australian METS companies are going to leverage that change in technical needs, and if they're sensible, do very well out there.
Claire, I could add something to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think if an Australian Mets company has a technology that is world class and can improve the bottom line, then going after the existing operators who will be squeezed in the next couple of years of the Prabowo government, they will be pressured into conceding more share to government. Those guys might well be ready to spend handsomely on improving their bottom line. So don't ignore the existing operators, because they've got knowledge, they'll understand good technical capability, and they could well be ready to spend on buying that opportunity.
No, good point.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I can see another question in here that kind of goes off that as well. So obviously there's a lot of new players in the market. If you're an Australian Mets company who's also new to the market, how do you make yourself credible, and how can you show that you're worth that second conversation and looking into? What would you recommend for that?
I think it's a question for you, Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Look, we've all been there. We've all been in the room and pitched whatever we're pitching. As I said before, use Austrade, get your message right, and get in front of these guys. Thereafter, it's really up to the quality of the message you deliver and the product you have. You'll find that if your product is good enough and the pitch is right and the message is right, you will do okay. You will get that second opportunity. But in saying that, the commitment to the market, the ability to visit a few times, get in front of these guys, not just expect that you can pick up, do the occasional Zoom call and maintain a relationship. That's not how it works. Face-to-face is still an important thing, and developing that senior relationship is absolutely vital. I've done business with some miners, and they want to see you at their house for a cup of tea on a Sunday afternoon, which seems a far away from the sort of business that we're used to, but it's what they expect. I've also dealt with miners who have 10 guys hanging around until 11 o'clock at night because he's busy and he wants to see you at 11 o'clock. And that's sort of crazy, and it's outside of the sort of realm that we're used to, but it's not unusual in Indonesia. Bill, would you agree with that? Some of these very, very high-end guys expect you to hang around until 8, 9, 10 o'clock.
Absolutely, Martin. It's very counterintuitive. But if you don't do it, there's no way you're going to get any business.
Yeah, you just got to sometimes bite the bullet.
Yes.
And I've bitten a few bullets that I don't like biting, but yeah, that's the way it is.
No, thank you. Well, we are coming to the end of the webinar. I do just want to ask, there is 2 more questions. If everybody's all right with that, we'll just finish the questions. So the first question was around, obviously at the moment, safety and mitigating hazards is really of high importance to Indonesian mining companies. Do you think that the changes to the operators is going to change that? Or do you think actually the focus on welfare and the focus on supporting is going to make that even more of a priority moving forward?
Was that for me, Claire, do you think?
Either of you, who would like to go first?
Look, I think the ESG is becoming a much more important element in the whole exercise. I will be honest, sometimes I think it's paid lip service, but it is a real element. Fatalities on mining sites are not uncommon, and they are regarded and seen as a pretty serious issue, especially interaction with the public. I've dealt with a number of mining companies who at least once a year one of their haul trucks will kill someone, and that becomes a real issue. So mitigating those sort of issues is an important part of the business. And if we all want to sleep at night, we've got to put the best foot forward and make sure that these things are, as far as is possible, reduced to an absolute minimum.
And if I might add there, Martin, the new emphasis on control in the Indonesian mining industry also encompasses an insistence on strict compliance by mining companies with the applicable regulatory environment. Indonesia actually has extensive laws and regulations about workplace safety, about environment protection, about no pollution, etc. The reality is that in the past, well-connected Indonesian mining companies were treated very leniently, shall we say, in terms of their compliance or non-compliance with those requirements. But that has demonstrably changed. And accordingly, failure to comply with workplace safety, failure to comply with environmental rules, polluting activities, etc., is the best way for an Indonesian mining company to find its mining license cancelled in no uncertain terms. Okay, so I think, like it or not, Indonesian mining companies are being forced to pay a lot more attention to these issues, which again I think bodes well for Australian nets companies that can offer workable products and solutions to improve workplace safety, environmental protection, and ensure no or minimal pollution of the environment.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would provide a lot of opportunities for, I'm sure, many of the people on the call today. And then a final question. I think this one's for you, Bill. So many of the Australian METS companies, we know, work with some of the major miners. So they're likes of Vale and PT Freeport. But do you see the government changes in ownership impacting those kind of their long-term commitment to Indonesia?
Okay, so you've got to draw a distinction, Claire, between those mining companies that are already here and multinational mining companies that are not here and might be considering coming to Indonesia. Now, the reality is that the Freeports and the Vales have so much capital invested in the ground in Indonesia that they face two alternatives. They can write their investment down to zero and leave, or sell it at a fire sale price to a state-owned enterprise, or they can knuckle down and do what the government tells them to do. And the reality is, as long as the marginal cost of complying with the new regime is less than the marginal revenue that they derive from continuing to operate, they'll take that second course. So I don't think that those major mining companies that are already here and heavily invested in the Indonesian mining industry are going to leave. What you do need to be mindful of is multinationals who are not here are probably very unlikely to come to Indonesia in the current regulatory environment, because there are better opportunities elsewhere. And indeed, we've seen in the last 10 years BHP, Newmont, Newcrest, Sherritt, Rio Tinto, household names in the international mining industry who had a small presence in Indonesia, but not many billions invested in the ground, say, no, this is not for us, and we're leaving. But you need to draw that very important distinction between those that are already here and majorly invested in Indonesia and those who are not here and might be looking at coming to Indonesia. So the big players that are already here, I think they've decided the marginal revenue of continuing to operate outweighs the marginal cost of compliance.
That's good to hear. So thank you so much to both of our speakers. I think everyone will agree. It's been an incredibly informative session. I've learned a lot, and I know which book I'm going to go and purchase for my bedtime reading before I do come to Indonesia. So I'm sure I won't be the only one who's going to be reading that book. So thank you again to both of our speakers, and to Helen as well, who's already left. As I say, I'll be sharing the recording and the slides, because there was a lot of really important information on both Martin and Bill's slides that I'm sure many of you will want to look back at. I will just share, we do have one last Slido presentation. So if you do have your phones handy, if you could just scan that QR code, that just gives us some feedback and lets us know where your priorities are moving forward. And if anybody has any questions, please do reach out. And I'm hoping to see many of you at Mining Indonesia in a few weeks' time. So thanks again to our speakers, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, guys.